I think that Evil Genius 2 is the best phone game I've ever played, except that it comes on PC. Obviously, when I call it a mobile game, that doesn't just mean what console it comes on, but also the general appeal and feeling to the game. When I spend time on Evil Genius 2, it really does feel like I'm playing through one of the old browser-based Dungeon Keeper games that used to take up hours of my time on Facebook. After all, it's all about slowly building up resources and expanding your base in order to work up more power and new capabilities over time. But what makes a game like this different from a typical computer game like the 4X genre is the distinct feeling of time as a resource, since Evil Genius frequently pushes the player into situations where you can do nothing but wait for things to happen. Suffice to say, this requires a very specific taste in video games in order to enjoy it, because it will eventually disappoint most players that get into Evil Genius 2 expecting an active player experience. And this is even in spite of the fact that they added the ability to speed up time by a factor of 5, allowing me to beat most playthroughs of the game within 15 hours, pretty comfortably. Yeah, I just mentioned playthroughs plural, as in, I've gone through this game and beaten it 4 times, one for each Evil Genius, but I'm not sure that's entirely a good indication of the game's value. After all, within the first 4 hours of my experience on release day, I already felt like Evil Genius 2 was a shallow experience. The heat system is broken, the tooltips are useless, the UI is clunky, the henchmen are imbalanced, the bases are both too restrictive and too expansive at the same time, and the story is incredibly hard to follow. Yet, I still felt compelled to put 70 hours into the game despite the fact that I could have easily made a much more interesting video about Monster Hunter Rise or Outriders that came out around the same time period. The fact is, I remember desperately enjoying the time I put into those old Facebook games back when browser-based defensive builders were all the rage. And somehow, Evil Genius 2 was able to condense the feeling those games give into a 24-hour experience that I just kept coming back to over and over. So, with the full understanding that no one else is likely to do an in-depth critique on a game like this, my name is JB Jet, and I want to take you on a journey that I wasn't expecting to go on when I first booted up this deeply flawed, but incredibly nuanced game. An Evil Genius 2 critique. I've already kind of summarized a bunch of the game systems, but the main appeal behind Evil Genius is the idea of building up this secret lair over the course of a campaign. To do so, you employ a never-ending stream of minions in yellow jumper suits who will eventually have the option of undergoing different types of training in order to upgrade into more advanced minion types. Once you have a stable inflow of minions, you can then spend them on the world screen in order to make money, reduce your heat, or complete quests for the main storyline. For anyone that played the original Evil Genius, this general gameplay flow is pretty much unchanged. The money from all these world missions goes back into the base in order to build even more research areas, cafeterias, staff rooms, casinos, and hidden traps along the corridors in order to forge your very own evil lair. This is, in fact, a modern recreation of the general appeal that was first developed in the old Dungeon Keeper games. Carve out the side of a mountain, train increasingly powerful minions to do your bidding, then defend the base against a large number of good guys that don't know who the main character in this story is. Now, a lot of the appeal from this type of game relies upon the general theme of the entry, with most dungeon games focusing on a slightly comedic form of satire in the fantasy world. The thing that sets Evil Genius apart is the fact that it seems to be based upon a slightly sci-fi alternate universe where you play as a James Bond villain that actually succeeds at their dastardly plan. The actual justification behind the main character can vary between a sense of longing for their home country to a lack of faith in the growth of our world order. It's the type of character motivations that could have led to some really interesting thematic analysis, except that all 4 of the main storylines tend to fall flat less than halfway through any given playthrough. You're not really going to be playing through Evil Genius 2 for the plot, which is actually a bit of a shame since it almost says something of value at times. Almost. Instead, I found myself in a never-ending loop of building, scheming, and fighting my way to victory as I continually struggled to do so in spite of the terrible UI choices. You might have noticed by now that a bunch of my gameplay was recorded using a gamepad instead of keyboard and mouse, which is a control scheme that surprised even me. The thing is, after I had already beat my first playthrough using the traditional controls, I ended up going back in with the Xbox controller just to see if it was any good, and suddenly I realized for some reason the UI, with several different pop-ups and mutually exclusive gameplay screens, makes a lot more sense when you're playing with the gamepad. And what's truly funny about this is the fact that Evil Genius 2 only ended up coming out on PC, meaning it probably should have been designed around the idea of keyboard and mouse at the forefront instead of this weird gamepad dependency. As such, several of the menus in the game have this exclusivity thing going on that will gray out all the other menu options until you exit out of the first menu you opened. A design choice that feels incredibly weird while using a mouse, and surprisingly natural when you start using a gamepad. So what did I do? I played through the game 3 more times using just the gamepad and had a much better time in general than I ever felt on the first playthrough. In the case that I needed more precision on a certain click or item placement, I could always just pause the gameplay in order to give myself as much time as necessary to hover over the one particular pixel in question. Of course, this isn't a very common occurrence anyways, since the vast majority of Evil Genius experience is focused around the macro control of your swarm. Despite the fact that you will work your way up to 300 employees at any given point in time, probably within the first couple hours of a new game, you don't actually get to control them directly. Instead, the mindless swarm will automatically go through their day, all sim style, as they eat when they're hungry, sleep, watch TV, and work on any open projects in the base whenever their stats are full. The closest thing you can do to simulate direct control is placing tags like capture, distract, or kill on the enemies that enter your base, which will cause nearby minions to react accordingly. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work well when you're trying to just gather up a bunch of minions into a ball to throw out the enemy agents all at once. So theoretically, this is where the red alert button would come in handy, as minions are forced to stop whatever they're doing in the base and start running around randomly. This will eventually cause minions to wander into the tagged enemies by pure chance, but it's still an awkward situation where you're literally just sending in these minions one by one into a blob of 10 soldiers with machine guns that will mow down everyone as they approach. As such, the strategic side of the game focuses on finding ways to centralize larger groups of minions into packs, then guide the enemy agents into those packs one at a time, and it kind of works. A lot of the time, it feels like I'm building one of those fancy Minecraft farms where I'm doing something the game obviously didn't intend me to do with its tools. Instead, the marketing for Evil Genius seems to want me to focus on using self-sufficient corridor setups with traps to deal with enemies instead of using brute force. If only that really worked in the actual gameplay. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that agents have a surprisingly high chance of turning off your traps before your dastardly plans can even get going. Sure, the poor quality agents that attack you at the beginning of the game might be walking into things head first, but as you go up the rungs on the world stage and start encountering average and even exceptional agents, it can become increasingly hard to get traps to even trigger in the first place. We're talking like a 1 in 10 chance that your freeze ray will even go off, meaning that most of the game devolved into me setting up winding corridors lined with dozens of traps, one after another. So yes, it might take 2 to 5 traps to actually incapacitate your enemies, but that doesn't take into account the quite often hundreds of kill zones I have to set up just to get those 2 to 5 triggers on any one bad guy. Then as you start to approach the endgame and start dealing with more and more super agents, they're more or less invulnerable to traps, unless you just so happen to catch them in the AoE for another agent triggering the traps. Unlike the first game, there is no way to auto-trigger traps every given period of time using the old freak system, so it really does become a case of setting up 100 booby traps and then hoping against all hope that at least a couple of them work out at the end of the day. As such, I quickly came to the conclusion that traps were only really useful for dealing with low-level agents, at which point I would have to set up kill rooms full of my muscle minions in order to deal with anything that got through the maze. In fact, the only way you can directly control a character and deal with problems like the agents is to use one of your henchman characters that you unlock by doing side quests throughout the story. These super characters tend to fulfill a variety of roles, from support minions to more combat-focused damage dealers, each with their own variety of special abilities that can be used to deal with more unique circumstances. Perhaps the best one, in my opinion, is the ability of Jubei to teleport to any area of your base at a moment's notice and get him into the fight just a little bit quicker. Unfortunately, some of these henchmen tend to be more valuable than others, as the more deception-based options are a bit more hands-on in order to get the best value out of them. Take for example Janet the Fan, who has the ability to wipe out an agent's memory of any bad things they've seen during their time in your base. This would theoretically reduce the heat they bring back to the world stage if the agent escapes the base, but this also requires the player to actually notice the agent, notice that the agent built up heat from a variety of hard-to-control sources, notice the agent is leaving, then finally have your henchmen arrive at the entrance in time to mind blank a single agent out of most likely a group of 5 to 10 enemies. Mind you, the agents never stop coming for your base. We're talking about a new group of 5 to 10 agents every minute or two at the very least, and the only way to stop more from coming is to just let the first group wander around and waste their time, ultimately making Janet's henchman special ability feel just a little disappointing. On the bright side, when I chose Janet for my first playthrough henchman, it also gave me a chance to really understand the heat system that Evil Genius relies upon as its primary escalation of force over a given playthrough. As you set up evil bases throughout the world that will passively steal money and allow you to do evil schemes, they will also raise the heat cap in that world region. The cap starts at 50 per region and increases by another 50 for each upgrade you do on top of that to unlock better passive income and more advanced missions in the area. Mind you, even if you choose to do nothing except collect the passive income, you're still going to be generating heat in those areas until they reach the heat cap and trigger a chance to send a group of agents towards your base. The quality of these agents is then determined by how much heat you have built up between all of the regions under a given agency, which is largely divided up by the continents. As such, the game starts you off by sending poorly trained agents to your base, which will slowly level up into machine gun holding soldiers and explosive saboteurs as you piss off more and more of the world map. It's kind of a choose your own difficulty level type of system, where you can either take your time and keep the heat level low for less of a challenge, or go balls to the wall and try to steal as much money as you can to make up for the near constant attacks you'll be fending off. The thing is, those initial investigator type agents that get sent to your base have a unique characteristic where they're less concerned with killing you off, and more concerned with gathering evidence. They enter the base and immediately start searching every corner of your dusty halls for incriminating items like prison cells, gold pallets, and power generators. I guess for some reason, unlicensed electricity plants are a big deal in this world, but whatever, you get the point. Unfortunately, if you try to use the distract option with these agents, there's also a chance that they will just get angry at your minions, kill them, then take a picture of the body bag they just created as evidence of your evil deeds. Perhaps as a response to the AI manipulation we used to do in the first Evil Genius, these new agents will also stay on your island for a long time. The only time I've actually seen an agent leave because they ran out of patience took around an hour on 5 times speed for the rogue super agent to leave when I never gave her any gold in the base to actually steal. Otherwise, the main method for getting agents to leave is to either kill them, allow them to build up heat, or decrease their motivation to 0 with freeze traps and games in the casino. I specify freeze traps here because every other trap in the game is devoted to either manipulating AI movement or just outright killing them. So get ready to fill your base with snow cones if you want to avoid the body bags. Unfortunately, this all coalesces into a single larger problem where every base starts to look basically the same. There's no reason to make a maze of hallways to waste the agent's time, because an entire hour should give them the leeway they need to explore everything they would ever want to see. There's very little point in putting the distract tag on enemy agents, because it will result in your weaker minions getting outright murdered half the time that they fail the hidden stat check. There's little point in using murder traps, since the other investigators will end up using the body bags to develop the heat you were trying to prevent in the first place. And finally, the player will eventually realize that the heat generated by escaping agents is so pointless in the grand scheme of things that it can eventually become a good thing when used correctly. Hear me out. As soon as you develop a radio tower on any of the regions in the world map, they will start generating heat passively. It might take 30 minutes to an hour for the bar to fill up before getting locked down for 5 minutes of unsped up time before starting the process over at 0 heat. If for some reason you want to reduce the heat in an area, you can send some advanced deception goons on a mission that will eventually reduce the heat to 0 over the course of 30 minutes to an hour. Or, your other option for reducing heat will take 5 to 10 seconds, but cost a sizable amount of gold and intel points, which are a resource developed by minions working inside the base. Now, this might be useful if you want to avoid having agents attack your base, but we also have to remember that the investigator agents, which are the most common agent type in the game, will also remain passive unless you go out of your way to start hurting them. As such, we have a choice. Spend several high-level minions to lower the heat level over the course of an hour. Spend a high amount of cash and rare resources to lower the heat within 10 seconds, or let the area go into lockdown for 5 minutes of game time or 2 minutes of real time while suffering only the chance that someone comes to your base. It was at this point where I realized that letting the map zones overheat was the most efficient use of my resources. Something that causes Evil Genius to really devolve into an idle game in many ways. I didn't have to care about most of the agents that came through the front door, and anyone that gets through the trap hall would most likely do nothing but build up 5 heat points, then leave, which only helped to reset the heat timer on the world map just a little bit quicker. Any soldiers that came by most likely would get taken care of by the same frost traps as the investigators, since they also leave when they lose motivation due to stat penalties. Things only start to pick up in this regard when you start to get into the late game and the enemy starts to use your back door. On 2 out of the 3 map options, there's a back door to your evil lair, which isn't so easy to just set up a trap hall next to it. This back door will be connected to your helipad, which allows you to send your minions out into the world, so you want to make sure that your most important go-getters aren't getting burnt up by any traps that you set at this secret entrance. Also, the only agents that come in through this back entrance are typically going to be the more advanced types that can barely be hit by 1 out of every 100 traps, so here's where the minion kill zones start to become much more important. Between the lack of any conflict behind the heat mechanics and the ease of control that comes to mind with the front entrance, the player should have the chance to build up a pretty impressive armory area before your enemies even start using this back door, at which point you're going to need to start killing off the super agents that come by anyways. Once you start building up enough heat at the world stage, another wrench in the mechanism comes in the form of these super agents for each of the respective agencies. Some of these are super soldiers that will murder their way through your base, while others like the super heist agent named Symmetry will actually spawn inside your vault room, eliminating any risk that your trap hallways might have posed in the first place. Thankfully, you can avoid triggering these super agents by simply not doing evil schemes in the area that they're watching on the main world map. As a result, the zone that these super agents are currently standing in becomes a sort of no-go zone on the world map that I might check back on every couple of minutes to see if they've left for greener pastures. This is especially important to do considering the fact that several of the super agents are more than capable of murdering several hundred minions on a single visit, unless you catch them in the middle of a decent kill zone. After all, with the lack of actual control, your minions can and will just walk into the line of fire one at a time to get picked off like ducks going down a sewer drain until the enemy eventually runs out of bullets. But once again, this all gets undermined by the single failure type in the entire game, the death of your evil genius. If you park your evil genius in some far-off corner of the map, or even create a loop of hallways and staircases to hide the Grand Master of your plans, the enemy agents will basically never find you. I've had incidents where this happened, and every single one of my 300 minions died off in the final assault on my base, but I could always buy them back with my vaults full of millions of gold. I wasn't dead yet because the enemy never found my genius, and eventually a measly buildup of low-cost minions simply overwhelmed the final challenge of the game with very minimal effort put in myself. This would be even more underwhelming if I was playing on the easier difficulties, but a solid savings of 1 million gold is more than enough to win every single matchup on the hardest difficulty, which struck me as mildly underwhelming. It all ends up wrapping around again back to the fact that this isn't meant to be an active player game. On a new match, I'll set the game speed to its highest setting and then just kind of sit there, building out my base at my own pace, fully confident in the fact that I can't really lose, unless I choose to do something incredibly reckless and pull in too many super agents at the same time. This was definitely a disappointment in some sense, because I certainly wasn't expecting the game to feel like an idle clicker, yet here I was, playing a base builder while using a gamepad and purchasing several hundred minions to throw against the good guys until they drowned under all the body bags. But eventually, I did start to value the game for what it was, and suddenly it became one of my favorite things to turn on when I got home from work and just wanted to watch some YouTube and not actually care about what I was doing while still feeling rewarded for the time investment. As such, I probably played through the majority of my time with Evil Genius 2 from a very different perspective than your average city builder fan, since the focus was on not being stressed by the game instead of feeling the active anxiety from challenging a 4X title on the hardest difficulty settings. The thing is, this also allowed me to see several of the deeper problems that quickly become apparent once you go through a couple of different playthroughs, namely the fact that almost every single design decision seems to be focused around the idea of padding out your game time. This isn't just talking about the quest design or the cinematics or the minion unlocks or the henchman quests, but even just the sheer basic building tools like the lack of a copy-paste option for item layouts, the lack of a consistent move item key, and the constant redesign incentives in the research tree. It all just serves to string out the game over several more hours than it truly deserves. But let's at least start with the research tree. You get access to scientists within the first hour of the game, so it starts off relatively strong as you unlock new traps, staircases, and the ability to cut through different types of rock. But then it locks you off after the first 2 rows of the research tree until you reach the next science minion later in the storyline. If you rush to that next act in the storyline, it might take you 2 hours if you know what you're doing, or 10 hours if it's your first time. Not very fun when you not only have nothing left to research, but also aren't sure if the game is bugging out or if you just need to push a little bit further to unlock the next set of tools in your toolbox. But then you get to the next set of scientists and the research starts up again. Now you have access to better generators and better gold racks to store money, along with another dig tool that can go even further into the expansion of your base. Except that now you've already realized the fact that you're not quite at the final research level yet, where you get access to even more cool stuff that you want to be building. Back to the drawing board and complete the main quest right up until the final couple hours of gameplay in the storyline, and you finally have access to the last level of research for your base. On the one hand, it might feel like the player finally has all the tools to build the evil lair of their dreams, except that you've already spent several million gold on building up all your infrastructure in order to get to this place in the story. You probably have the entire first floor completely filled with all manner of staff rooms and research labs and casino space, and then the game finally says, here's the tools, go have fun. And I suddenly could not care less about these endgame toys to play around with, because the game was pretty much over by the time that I actually got access to them. The first time the research tree unlocks more digging options, it affords me the growing room to really start building out all the different setups that I needed. When I researched the second digging option, it gave me just a little bit more space to expand, albeit at an increased cost per square. And then when I get to the end of the game and suddenly have yet another chance to dig deeper, but somehow I'm supposed to care about this last research level when I've already more or less met the hardest minion type requirements in the game. Of course, this is in addition to the several trees of upgrades which represent a net money loss if you choose to research them, or sometimes a drop in efficiency if you start placing items without thinking about them too hard. At one point in my first playthrough, I ended up researching these fitness machines that were supposed to make my standard minions just a little bit more powerful. Cool enough, except that it also required a scientist in order to run these machines, so I suddenly found my research almost completely stalled because all the researchers were busy buffing the random low quality minions. That was an unforeseen consequence, so I obviously just increased the number of science minions I had trained to balance things out, which also cost more money, which meant that I had to send more minions out into the world to make that money back, which meant more science minions were spending time buffing the basic minions that were probably about to get sent out for cash anyways. That got messy really quickly, but that's also only one out of the 12 total minion buffing machines, which require other higher quality minions to get distracted from the task that you actually want them to be doing. Several playthroughs on hard later, and I can safely say that you're better off ignoring these devices except for maybe the one that buffs muscle minion health stats. And this isn't the only questionable research either, since one of the most broken mechanics in the entire game are doors, of all things. You would think that doors are a good way to waste the enemy agent's time by locking off high-value areas behind a security clearance, except that all agents of any type can get through any door at any security level. The only difference between level 1 security doors and level 3 security doors is a 1 second open time versus a 6 second open time for both your minions and enemy agents. So for your enemies, this can become a mild inconvenience as they spend upwards of an hour on the fast forward time option just wandering your base, slowly opening doors. Meanwhile, each level 3 security door also represents a 6-second pause in between your minions getting to the task which they were assigned randomly while halfway across the map. Maybe they starve by the time they get to their task if it's too much of a walk, and then they wander off to get food. Another minion gets assigned to the task, and your generators are starting to catch fire due to the lack of maintenance. The other worst case scenario happens when your minions get into a fight right next to the door, and suddenly no one wants to fire their handguns at the bad guys that they can only see when the door opens every 6 seconds. Between these factors alone, doors are just such a waste of time compared to the lack of benefit they give you in most circumstances. But then the research tree goes on and makes this all even funnier. You can unlock these super doors that are supposed to work better than usual on saboteurs and robbers, but of course, I've only seen these types of agents spawn naturally maybe once per playthrough at most, as you start to approach the very last moments of the campaign. And you'll have the entire world wrapped around your fingers by this point, so it hardly even matters. Even then, it doesn't actually stop them, since any agent can open any door. It just delays them slightly longer than a normal door. The thing is, things got even worse than that. You can either spend 12,000 gold on a couple of lockers in some random corner of your base, or you can spend 88,000 gold and about 30 minutes of research time to achieve the same results with science. You can spend 5,000 gold on 2 communications desks in order to increase your radio power on the world stage, or you can spend 176,000 gold and waste the time of several of your most expensive minions to achieve the same result with science. With all this in mind, I'd say that only around 50% of the technology tree is actually useful. The rest of your options are either pointless, inefficient, or so poorly timed in the grand scheme of things that I was better off not researching those options regardless of whether I had the cash. Some players might look at these efficiency traps as an added challenge for the game as you try to rationalize what actually matters in any given playthrough. Yet, in many ways, I can only look at these things as an artificial form of difficulty. By giving a player several options where one is just straight up better in nearly every single way than another, I don't think it results in a particularly interesting choice. Sure, it might take a couple of minutes or a small test or two in order to determine what the facts of the situation are, but once you come to the right conclusion, you'll just end up choosing that same result nearly every time from there on. Take for example the capture mechanics behind the game that allow you to keep an agent alive until you either interrogate or brainwash them. You'll probably end up doing this in order to complete several of the quest objectives throughout Evil Genius, but if you end up using these tools with non-quest related characters, then interrogating an enemy can allow you to earn some free intel points. This is actually a better reward than you would expect at first glance, since the key resource that prevented me from completing quests at a faster pace was most often the restriction of intel costs for each mission. Unfortunately, the player is going to have to jump through some hoops in order to earn these free resources. First, you're going to have to take out the agent in the first place, which involves reducing both their health stats to 0 as well as their smart stats. Thankfully, the game makes this a little bit easier by allowing agents tagged for capture to take smarts damage each time they get hit when at low health. This effectively doubles the amount of health that any one agent will have, making them take twice as long to kill and likely resulting in the death of several more of your minions. But you take that small negative in stride and then start marching your new prisoner to the cell. Of course, you had to buy each cell, develop the high electricity cost in order to maintain them, find the space to put them, and then set up your interrogation chair as well. Small things in the grand scheme of your base in total, but enough of a hassle that it might break up your otherwise pretty room layout. All of which without any doors, of course, because doors are bad for you. Now, you get them into the cell, and the agent starts losing motivation at a steady rate. If you try to interrogate them while they have too much motivation, they'll simply break free of your interrogation chair and start killing your minions. Or, if you leave them in the cell for too long, they'll also simply break free of the cell and start murdering the minions around them. But you time things perfectly, clicking your way through the 5 button prompts it takes in order to get them to the interrogation chair, and you get lucky and a nearby minion gets assigned to the task instead of someone halfway across the base, and no one has a chance to break free. You earn those precious intel resource points, and then your minions have to take the body bag left from the interrogation to the crematorium. Altogether, you've probably caused the death of at least twice the number of minions it might usually take to subdue the agent, wasted the time of several workers, and forced yourself to participate in a list of inputs and button prompts that cannot be automated, unlike nearly every other part of your base. All for 1 or 2 intel points per interrogation, which could have just as easily been earned through the automated resource generation in less than 30 seconds or so. I'm not saying this is the wrong way to play the game. It can totally be fun seeing the funny animations play out on your first couple interrogation attempts, but when we're also dealing with a steady stream of agents every 5 minutes, then there's obviously some more efficient ways to deal with the mechanics of it all. And that's just the thing, isn't it? Evil Genius is in many ways a weird amalgamation of cool doodads and interactable objects that are fun to see play out the first couple times your minions interact with them, but mechanically, the game just doesn't stand up to long-term scrutiny. Can I put in the effort to turn my casino into a way to make money? Yes. I've even seen several setups that can drain an agent's motivation from max to 0 before they even enter the base proper. Then again, if any of the soldier type agents end up entering the casino and trigger combat because they see an object like a mess hall that's servicing your minions, then all the deception minions in that room with incredibly low combat stats are about to die. And since your arms room with all the guards is situated much deeper into the base, there's basically nothing you can do about this situation. Or you could just demolish the casino entirely and make a giant hallway full of freeze traps all the way from the front of your base to the guard room. It's much less fun and much less thematic, yet in 9 times out of 10, this setup is going to save the player a lot of headache in the long term compared to trying to set up the whole casino idea. Added to the pile of misfit toys, I guess. Next, we've got the decorations in the game, an entire list of potted plants and vending machines and mini computers that a player could use in order to make the base look just a little bit more homely. Some of them even have a side effect of giving minions in their vicinity a small mechanical buff, like a slower drain to their motivation or smart stats. Kind of cool, to be honest. If only the range on those items weren't so small, they barely affect a single interactable tool in each direction. If only the decorations actually told me the stats of how effective the buff was, so I could actually try to do the math on things to determine whether these things are worth it. If only the decorations didn't take up floor space and mess up the pathing AI on my minions. If only the wall decorations weren't getting in the way of my traps, televisions, and other actually useful wall items. I want to love this addition to the game. I wish all my layers looked like super cool interior designs, but they don't, because the decorations took up too many of my resources to bother with. Because the pros didn't outweigh the cons, and because I wasn't given enough information about the game to actually tell what these things really did to my minions, and that infuriates me, because those stats matter to me as a player. This puts me into an awkward situation, since my very last critique on Civilization 3 was generally positive about the multiple layers of hidden features and mechanics in the game. But now with Evil Genius 2, I'm presented with almost the same exact circumstance, with yet another game that tells you something is happening, but doesn't really tell you exactly what. I think the difference between both games is the fact that Civ 3 had a very defined and gradual difficulty curve that allowed you to learn these things over the course of a 100-hour journey. Sure, it was terrible that a lot of information was kept hidden from the player in that 2003 classic, but there was also a motivating factor that made the player want to learn from their mistakes and the general community. Conversely, with Evil Genius 2, the difficulty curve is much more shallow. Within the first 20 hours of playing the game, I had already started my first campaign on the hardest difficulty, already lining the halls with frost traps, already ignoring doors, already spamming the purchase minions button with the full knowledge my mastermind could never really be caught, and I would never fail. If there was still a degree of difficulty to work my way around, then maybe I would have felt encouraged to learn the best way to use decorations. Maybe I would have experimented with the henchman system just a little bit more, or tried to figure out what these uber loot items actually did, but that wasn't the case. And instead, I learned the path of least resistance to the end goal, where the best tool in the player's handbook is simply patience. After all, you as the player have full control over when every challenge and crisis in the game actually occurs. As such, the harder difficulty just encourages the player to interact with it much more passively instead of the strategic layers of play that you could find in any other 4X. Also, there's the fact that I am much more willing to excuse a couple poorly written tooltips in a game that came out 2 decades ago than I am to excuse bad explanations in a game that came out in 2021. The general standards of game design have changed over that time period, and suddenly a clunky UI and poor mechanical development are a mistake that developers should be more than aware of when putting together something that is supposed to resemble a strategy game. Unfortunately, these problems with a lack of good tooltips or explanations extends much further than the decoration system, with perhaps the worst offender of them all coming in the form of Uber Loot. These special loot items can be earned by completing several of the side quests that pop up over the course of the main campaign, with items like the Sands of Time, a piggy bank ride, or the Doors of Fort Knox. These items are evidently important enough that the main campaign requires players to earn at least 7 of the items before you can progress to the final part of the storyline. The downside to this being that you can only have one side quest active at a time, meaning that you can only target one of the Uber Loot items, or try to earn new henchmen, or defeat the super agents, or unlock new minion types on a mutually exclusive timer. This seems minor, but this also means that players are basically going to need to always be working on at least one Uber Loot item quest at every point in the story in order to keep up with the increasing loot requirements for the main campaign. If you didn't know this ahead of time and maybe tried working on the henchmen or super agent quests, then the game will simply soft lock you from progressing until you go back and start working your way through these Uber Loot items. And that's already annoying enough on its own, but then the Uber Loot items add on several penalties that affect your base while you're trying to unlock them. The Yeti Ice Block Uber Loot quest causes your entire base to suffer an unbearable heat wave that will quickly reduce the motivation of all your minions at the same time. This causes them all to work less often as they constantly have to return to the break rooms to restore their motivation. But it also more or less requires the player to double the amount of television stations you have in your base, unless you want upwards of several hundred minions just walking out on you over the course of the entire quest chain. This will most likely also stop you from progressing on the main quest line while working on this particular loot item, as well as just generally making it harder for you to even meet the needs of the side quest in the first place. But you make it through your random set of tasks, tracking down this Yeti stuck in an ice block, and finish the side quest. Congratulations, you've just unlocked a new Uber Loot item that you can place in your lair. What does it do for you? I don't know. The game isn't going to tell you. And based on a couple Reddit threads, it sounds like it might prevent fires from happening in a small radius around this giant decoration that will probably mess up your room designs. I've completed this quest 2 times and still have neither the interest or the motivation to ever place the actual loot item. If you place it somewhere easily accessible, then agents will steal it. If you try to place it in a room that wasn't designed with them in mind, it's unlikely to be very effective. And finally, around half the time the loot items are genuinely a detriment to the overall efficiency of your base. Take for example the Excalibur loot item that can give a muscle minion a chance to return from death 1 time. Pretty cool in concept, except that even after that minion gets a revive, every single muscle minion is going to want a chance to try and pull the sword out, causing them to walk halfway across the base, then waste half their stat bar pulling at the sword in vain, only to then waste even more time regenerating the stats that they just lost on a tool they couldn't even use in the first place. And that's a net negative in 99% of the circumstances that one of my minions tries to use Excalibur. Next, there's Rumpelstiltskin's Golden Spinning Wheel, which your minions can use to generate 5,000 to 15,000 gold after sitting in front of it for several minutes. Not entirely as bad as the Excalibur situation, but still a bit of a waste, considering the likelihood you'd probably prefer that minion to be doing something else instead. I will admit that most of the Uber Loot items are generally a good thing for your base, like the Snow Globe that will reduce enemy agent motivation, the Maple Syrup machine that will restore your own minions' stats over time, and the Flying Pig that can entertain your workers for a little bit. But you also never have the ability to know for sure exactly what these items are going to do until you actually put them down. I mean, I could put Pandora's box down in the middle of my base and hope that it does something good for me, but do I really want to take the chance of something called Pandora's box, considering I've already seen the negative effects that things like Excalibur's sword can have? Ironically, one of the best examples of the Uber loot actually being a benefit to the player is one of the Season Pass rewards for the game. If you can unlock the Trojan Horse loot, it involves a cute little quest where the agents use it to sneak several soldiers into the middle of your base. But once you clear that up, it quickly becomes an absolutely indispensable tool in any arsenal. The Trojan Horse unlocks the ability to take on a special type of world map quest that only cost 5 normal minions and 5 guards in order to earn 90,000 gold in only 1 minute of in-game time. I'm not saying this is absolutely broken, I'm just saying that you'll be lucky to find quests that award 120,000 gold in 3 minutes near the end of the game. So these repeatable Trojan Horse quests can really speed up your gold income if you use them right. So it's not necessarily pay to win, it's just pay to have an easier time overall if you pick up this one relatively overpowered item compared to everything else. Definitely not unbalanced at all. But I suppose that brings up the weird fact that a game like this released with a season pass in the first place, which feels a little weird when it comes to a builder style game. With this season pass you're going to get a future extension of the main campaign, so probably another side quest that's mutually exclusive with doing anything else in the game, which also causes some random crisis in your base with a resulting minor improvement to something you can do at the end of it. Next is a lair item pack, which will probably include a bunch of items that don't necessarily tell you what they do until you test them out with a couple of guinea pigs and try and figure out if any of them are actually useful for your worker efficiency. And next is a henchman pack to extend your options in the list of henchmen that are ultimately completely optional for the game considering the lack of any real difficulty. And finally, we'll get a minion pack that will probably add another type of deception and guard minions, which may or may not be marginally more effective than the minions that came before, but you'll most likely only need to really use them for a small list of quests on the world stage. I'm not saying that I already regret my choice to purchase the Season Pass on release, but the things this pass will eventually include are so minor in the grand scheme of things that I'm not likely to ever return to the game, to be honest. And here we are already talking about the things that Evil Genius is going to eventually add to its mechanics, because I've already reached the point where I'm not sure if I want to keep pushing the game even further into the trash compactor. I could tell you about the henchman quests and how every single new henchman you get requires you to complete 3 separate side quests to unlock their character. I could tell you how you're probably going to have to kill each of those henchmen around 3 to 5 times over the course of those side quests, and that somehow gets them to join your army. And I can tell you how the henchmen seem to randomly become much less powerful the moment that you even start to use them, compared to when they killed hundreds of my minions one at a time during the side quests. But in a lot of ways, this is just me nitpicking my way through a game that somehow motivated me to play through its entirety at least 4 times. How can I even try to justify why I chose to put nearly double the amount of time into Evil Genius 2 compared to Monster Hunter Rise, despite Rise being an objectively better game in every single way? And I think the answer to that question has to be player expectations. If I look back at the Dungeon Keeper genre, there's obviously the original Dungeon Keeper games, but there's also the Dungeons series that's been the best performing follow-up in the modern day entries to the genre. War for the Overworld kind of fell by the wayside, and I guess you could theoretically say that Empires of the Undergrowth seems like a Dungeon Keeper game, but we don't really have that many other options. If you want a game where you can play as a James Bond villain and develop an evil lair in the modern era of technology, your only choice is basically going to be the Evil Genius series. So when you try and compare Evil Genius 2 to the only real competition it has in the incredibly niche James Bond villain genre, I have to point out that it is still certainly a better game than its predecessor. Before Evil Genius 2 came out, I did end up going back to play through the original and had fun with the 10 hours or so it took me to finish the first island and make it to the second half of the campaign. The thing is, Evil Genius 1 was a game that is very concerned with taking advantage of the several different exploits in the game. If you want to keep agents out of your base, just build a bunch of doors inside a fake entrance. If you want to make money, just wait a couple hours stealing money during the tutorial sequence. If you need late game money, set up a perpetual motion trap that will basically never allow agents to escape. And while the original generally asked players to wait less time for each action they did, the way the AI pathing and the need to transport gold around your base worked resulted in most actions in the original taking much longer than they actually do in Evil Genius 2. The sequel is just so incredibly streamlined compared to the original that the old tools like traps and doorways now seem incredibly pointless and shallow. But this also might have been intentional design decisions, since players were more or less forced to exploit those tools in their original release in order to make the best of the situation at hand. So was there something lost in the exchange? Yes, absolutely, but I can also say that I much prefer my time spent with the renovations of Evil Genius 2 compared to the original. And when that means that I've been waiting 17 years for another chance to explore this incredibly niche style of game theme and mechanics, it suddenly makes a lot of sense why I felt the need to absolutely devour Evil Genius 2 despite its flaws. The one thing I really haven't touched on up until this point in the critique is the general state of the main story for the game. Once again, it's improved from the original, with a cutscene that plays in between each new chapter of the main quest, which helps to explain your character's motivations throughout the story. The thing is, even on the first couple campaigns where I genuinely did try to keep up with what was happening, I always got the weird feeling that I was missing entire chunks of exposition that might have tied things together. As a result, most of my actual tasks and objectives for each new chapter seemed more than a bit arbitrary. Like, sure, I was abducting a group of scientists to brief my plans for a device that would help me take over the world, and then I had to execute them to keep the plan secret, when none of the scientists would actually help me make the device. An understandably evil sequence of events, to be sure, but not really a logical one. Why did I even bother trying to get those scientists to join my team if it seems like there was always a plan B option when they refused to help? But then things started to get even more confusing as I made my way through each of the campaigns and slowly started noticing the same quests repeated over and over. With Red Ivan, you invite the commanders of the largest armies in the world, then kill them. With Emma, you have to invite a group of politicians to your lair, then kill them. With Maximilian, you have to invite a series of investors to the lair, but also kill them. In every Evil Genius story, the second act of the campaign revolves around you fighting off some version of a good guy nemesis. Zalika has to deal with another scientist that's trying to break her technology, but she ends up rewriting the software and improving the Doomsday device. Red Ivan has to face off with his old nemesis, Atomic Olga, but then he finds an easy source of Doomsday ammunition in the process. Maximilian has to fight off the board chairman for his company, but eventually just ends up mind-controlling her to take back control of the situation. And finally, Emma has to face off against her old friend John Steele Sr., who allows her to relinquish what was left of her humanity and develop a specialized type of trap for your lair. The same exact gameplay objectives played out over 4 different storylines, with only slight differences to the order of events and the flavor text in between. The thing is, a lot of these storylines are punctuated by some genuinely entertaining moments, such as the cutscene where Emma kills off John Steele.
We've both seen enough of the world. You and I are probably the only 2 sane people left alive.
If you really think I'm anything like you...
I don't, John. I am ambitious, brave, far-sighted, and most importantly, alive. Goodbye.
Ah!
Hear me now, minions. Our greatest obstacle is gone. John Steele Sr. is dead.
That felt emotional and poignant to her development as a character. but that's also the exception to the rule among a sea of uninteresting moments and storylines that can barely hold themselves together. There was obviously enough of a difference in between each of the storylines for me to feel a need to play through each of them, but there was also so little of substance that I can't actually remember the beat-by-beat rationale for how each of them got from point A to point B. Instead, a lot of how I feel about each of these storylines relates to the character of the Doomsday device, which sounds kind of funny without context. These massive machines that take up the center of each of your bases unironically becomes some of the most interesting characteristics of each and every playthrough. First off, they look cool. If I had nothing else to do but wait for things to refresh, I was probably spending that time just staring at the animations on these mega machines like I was caught in some sort of trance. Second, they each come with a penalty to your base for each time that you use them. On Zalika's machine, a couple of your minions will lose control and become hostile. Maximilian's machine will turn minions into statues of gold, while Ivan's device will cause your entire base to erupt into fire at a time. In terms of benefits, each of these devices will also allow the player to undertake a low-cost mission in the targeted region that usually awards between 250 to 500,000 gold per shot. Add to this the fact that each of the Doomsday machines goes by an acronym that is purposefully never explained in the story, yet perfectly embodies a sense of irony, like how the Midas machine turns people to gold. Then, as we approach the final moments of the game, after you fight off all the good guys, we get to crank these machines up to 10 and fire them off at each of the main agency hubs on each continent. Without context, all this seems to do is turn the zone into the corresponding color for your evil genius and stop that zone from being active anymore. But after all the buildup of the game, you can imagine the fires that Red Ivan just caused in his home country. You can imagine the brain-dead zombies that Zalika just created in their capital. And you can imagine the way that Emma's venom must be killing off the citizens in the streets. Precisely because you've had the chance to see those things affecting your own base every time you fire off the device. Then the game tops things off with a final cinematic that's highly tailored to your individual evil genius and shows off their own particular form of world domination. And yet, there always has to be something bad for me to bring up about the game for every nice thing I have to glow about. Despite being the most charismatic part of the game, the fact that you have to go out and steal the ammunition to use each Doomsday device from your world table kinda sucks. It breaks up the flow of the main story, and even when you've killed off every major agency in the game, you still have to send out your minions on 1 or 2 missions at a time to steal the last couple ammunition points that you need in order to just close out the game. For every moment where you get to execute a nemesis character that's been a pain in your side, there's probably another key character that just decided to walk off your island, despite the fact that you spent 30 minutes on the world screen trying to abduct them in the first place. For every quest that awards a new loot item, there seems like there's at least one objective that doesn't play out the way the game indicates that it should be playing out. There's several henchmen that are completely missable if you choose to do a couple quests in the wrong order, and yet there's no indication of this risk at any point in the game. Things can get so messed up in the actual order of events that I've heard several reviews talk about how they weren't really sure what they were supposed to do to advance the story despite having an objectives bar permanently pinned to the screen. And honestly, I can't blame them, since several of the objectives in the game require you to do unintuitive tasks, like doing research on the Doomsday device. Most of the time that means opening the tab to the research screen and clicking a button there, but in one case during the Maximilian questline it requires you to build a specific intel machine inside of the communications room, then specifically task minions to use that device before you can proceed. I'm not saying this was hard to do, but it was certainly confusing when the objective doesn't tell you what machine to use for the task, nor whether there are any prerequisites, nor even an indication of what room type that you should be looking into for the answers to these questions. So when I'm on my 4th playthrough and still finding moments where I have no idea what the game is really trying to ask from me, I don't think we can always blame the player in this case. Take for example the final sequence in the game that tells the player to survive the super agent attack. To complete this objective, you don't actually have to just survive the attack, but you also need to kill everyone from the attacking force that was sent into your base. Among the attack force were a couple of robbers that probably just walked past the front lines where everyone else was fighting, since those particular minions were trying to just get into my vaults. But then the game recognizes that it wants you to kill all the good guys, so it doesn't give them the AI command to leave the base with the stolen gold. Otherwise, it would softlock a player that failed to kill everyone. Instead, I ended up killing the vast majority of the agents in my base, only to spend the next 30 minutes scanning my way through the lair trying to figure out why the objective hadn't triggered. Eventually, I found out that the robbers were not only hiding in the back of my electricity room, but they were also disguised so that even when they were tagged for kill, none of my minions could actually see them to start the combat encounter. If this wasn't my 4th journey through the main campaign, I would have just assumed that the end sequence was broken, and I wouldn't be able to beat it because the triggers weren't working for some reason. But because of my prior experience, I did have the faintest idea that I should play Where's Waldo for half an hour in order to avoid going through the final attack once again. And frankly, I don't think this is the type of experience that a new player should need to worry about. Whether it's the fault of bugs or poor objective explanations, I can't simply ignore the fact that the game has forced me to reverse engineer what the storyline actually wants me to do instead of what it's telling me to do every single playthrough. There's just so many questionable decisions about the game, and yet I can also look at the mass media account for Evil Genius 2 and their copious amounts of really high quality trailers that they pumped out up until release. I mean, even after just a couple of seconds, you can probably already tell that most of the brand developed Evil Genius videos are going after this Watch Mojo top 10 list type of vibe, and I kind of live for it. In many cases, this is one of the only ways to really get good information about what's going on in the game itself, like how they describe the 4 henchmen that you get to choose between near the start of the campaign, as well as details about all their abilities. But if I was going to choose my henchmen based off the information that Evil Genius actually gives to the player, all you get is a code name and a brief intro to the side quest. On one hand, I'm sitting over here watching some top-tier video content that taps into the perfect style of mass market appeal that makes me really want to buy and play this game, while at the same time, the actual storyline fails to convey even half the information that they've just used to entice potential buyers. In addition to this Watch Mojo type of thing, the marketing team released a pre-build of the game to a ton of strategy Let's Play channels and told them they can only record 1 or 2 hours of gameplay and lock things off after a certain story moment early on. Mind you, most of the problems that I personally had with the game don't really become noticeable until halfway through the campaign, and are certainly less of a big deal for players that aren't interested in testing out the harder difficulties. So letting these big YouTubers play for a couple hours or less is like the perfect way to make sure that they don't get enough context to see any of the more glaring issues that you might eventually run into. I bring all this up because the marketing plan they developed for the game hit me hard, and it probably wormed its way into more than a couple other gamers too. I was super hyped going into Evil Genius 2, which is part of the reason why it hurts so much when the actual systems didn't meet my expectations in quite that same way. I want to feel like a supervillain setting up elaborate strings of traps to lure in the agents of good, but the game just doesn't seem like it wants me to do that. The thing is, the developers are actually trying to do something with the game moving forward. On April 28th, 2021, less than a month after the game's initial release, they also gave players the first major patch that was meant to resolve many of the pacing problems throughout the game. Gold heists now reward more money on the world stage. Heat-reducing missions are more effective and for long periods of time. There's now a wider variety of schemes to complete. all mission objective schemes were reduced to around 10 seconds long, and the ammunition schemes for the Doomsday device were made easier and quicker to finish off the game. The effectiveness of both muscle minions in battle as well as agents have been buffed, and the time to open doors with minions has been reduced compared to agents. All in all, these changes are nothing but improvements to the general gameplay, as far as letting the player control the pace of the story instead of waiting for the tools that you need over time. And while this doesn't fix all of my complaints about the game, it at least shows that the dev team are actually trying to improve this thing over time. All to say that within a couple of months, this critique might not even reflect the current status of the game if they keep making big updates in the same manner. Unfortunately, that's not really going to help out when it comes to me or the many other fans who picked it up on day one. So while they might be able to fix up the rough edges like the bugs and the UI explanations that plague this title, the general nature of the game will remain a mostly idle experience, simply due to the lack of minion control. And I think that's perfectly okay, since this does create a unique game experience that, while shallow, was also very therapeutic to work my way through without any true sense of stress or challenge. You can probably tell by this point in the critique, but I feel deeply conflicted about my experience with Evil Genius 2. On the one hand, it represents a unique theme and gameplay options that you'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. But on the other hand, it also represents a game that is not only clunky to play and hard to understand, but also intentionally designed to waste the player's time. It is simultaneously a vast improvement over the original, yet also under-polished compared to our modern expectations for a video game. So much so that despite a couple of amazing moments and the genuine fun that I've had with Evil Genius 2, I don't think I could ever recommend it to people in good conscience. For me, it was the perfect watch YouTube and kind of pay attention to the phone game in the background type of experience, and that's not for everyone. Ironically, that means I've also put in 10 times the amount of man hours into Evil Genius 2 compared to Outriders, and now I can walk away from the game with a sense of satisfaction based on the fact that it actually has an ending, unlike certain other games that came out in the same time period. I think this says less about the quality of Evil Genius and more about the general state of video games as a whole, that I look at the fact that Evil Genius 2 actually finishes its story on release as a genuine selling point. And now I can say that I did it. I beat the game, I took over the world, and crushed the forces of good into the dust. And you can too, if you're willing to jump through more than a couple of hoops along the way. Before I go, I usually try to shout out some other cool YouTube channels that I've been watching recently that work on a similar type of long-form critique. So this time, considering the cartoonish style of Evil Genius, there's a chance that you might like the work done by Super Eyepatch Wolf, as he usually focuses on anime and wrestling documentaries, but he also does some interesting projects on real-world problems like con artists and fake martial arts. Or if you want someone with a bit more heartwarming feel, check out Noralites, who tends to focus on the state of female marketed anime. I'm recommending a couple of anime critics on this video because most of the other video game critics that I see on YouTube tend to not focus on the type of game that Evil Genius is. So if you want to see some more content about Evil Genius, your only real option is going to be a critique of the original by Snakerer, which is actually so on point about everything in that game that there's no reason that I would ever need to make an Evil Genius critique, because he just says everything perfectly. Practically perfectly. Otherwise, if you want to help out the channel a little bit, pressing the subscribe button can help let me know that I'm at least doing something right. Ultimately, I still feel a little bit mixed about my reaction to the game, because I generally prefer to talk about the good parts of the game instead of the bad, and I think that my time with Evil Genius 2 was a net positive, but in order to convey that sense of fun, it had to come with too many caveats along the way. Hopefully my next project will be at least a little bit more positive in nature as I work my way through some more classic games, but I'm also looking forward to several of the new releases that are set to come out this summer. Still, I hope you have a fantastic day, week, or month until we have a chance to meet again. Thanks for watching. Or World Order. It's the type of character mode It's the type of character plot which is actually a bit of a actually a bit of a shame. Of course, this isn't a very good... Get out of the way, cat. No, stop. Stop. I could always just pause the gameplay in order to give myself as much time as necessary to hover over the one. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that agents have a surprise things head first, but as you go up the rungs on the world stage, I guess for some reason unlicensed electricity plants are half the time that they fail the hidden stat check. Oh god, that one hurt. Oof. Big oof. Agents, which are the most common agent type in the game, will items without thinking about them too hard. At one point in my first playthrough, you'll probably end up doing this in order to complete several of the quest objectives throughout the game, but clicking your way through the 5 button prompts it takes in order to get from the in order to get them into the to the interrogation chair and a piggy bank ride or the doors of Fort Knox. Ugh. Don Steele Sr., who allows her to relinquish what was left of her humanity, who allows her to relinquish